immigrant or a temporary visa or otherwise would become a full-fledged U.S. citizen. Madeline, what do you think would be the impact if the Supreme Court upholds this order?
I think that there's a significant impact if things change. Here's why. So, for the longest time, since America's inception, we have been a nation of immigrants where you could come here and start a life and be an American. It's something that Ronald Reagan used to profess proudly. Essentially, what the Trump administration now is saying is that when our forefathers decided to grant citizenship to anyone who was born here, what they really meant was that the children of slaves, once slavery was outlawed, would then become citizens. That it wasn't referring to everyone. This is an argument that a very qualified attorney named Mr. Sauer has argued. He is a very, very smart attorney, but I'm telling you right now that I believe that all the deference that President Trump has gotten from the Supreme Court is leading up into this, so that the Republican justices will have some clout in saying, President Trump, you're wrong here. I can't imagine a conception of this law where the right of American citizens is taken away for birthright citizenship. It's not American. It's not. There's no precedence in the law.
It's for children of slaves.
Just follow up on that.
Yeah. So I'm an attorney too, and this all stems from the 14th Amendment, where it says people are citizens if they're born from naturalized or in the United States and in the jurisdiction of the United States. The question why the Supreme Court took this case is, did the framers of the Constitution intend for, again, the differentiation between illegal immigration, which we all welcome. We are a nation of immigrants. My other guest there is exactly right about that. But illegal immigration is different. And to do it this way, to allow chain migration, where if you just cross the border and you have children, you're basically importing whole societies and not just welcoming individual immigrants who choose to be Americans. This means that the United States government, the people have no sovereign power if, in fact, you can come in illegally and gain citizenship. That's the question before the court, and was that intended for what the framers said? This case, the first cases on this were not the beginning of the founding, about 150 years ago, and has to do with slavery. And that was whether or not slaves, when they had children, or slaves when they came into the country or born a certain way, were they citizens? So this is really untested ground for the court, and the court has to see what the framers meant, what any legislation around it, and whether or not the case law over the last 150 years is or is not applicable, or if this is something that is testing an entirely different set of theories with regard to illegal immigration.
And Madeline, do you see this as part of Trump's efforts to stop illegal immigration? And the case that they have here, do you think that it's, seeing how the fact that the Supreme Court took it up and they're considering it, it gives it some amount of consideration here.
Yeah, of course. And I agree with everything that my co-panelists had said, except for the part about chain migration. It would be easier for me to wrap my head around this argument about people coming in here illegally and then benefiting from being here illegally. I get that, because there's other areas of the law where that makes a difference. If I hadn't seen constant statements from DHS or Stephen Miller talking about chain migration being such a major problem in a racist fashion. Because what's happened here, right, is that it is individuals that this impacts. And that's why the Supreme Court has taken this up, because earlier on in the year, the Supreme Court said, okay, district judges can't make a rule for the entire country, right? They can develop an opinion on what President Trump has said as it pertains to the litigants in front of them, but not for the entire country. So it's actually the exact opposite, right? It's an individual who is obtaining citizenship, not a group of people. And that's specifically what the Supreme Court decided earlier on in the year, if that makes sense. So the Supreme Court taking this up now is them saying, we're going to make a big decision so that people aren't confused like they were earlier throughout the year, where people could have babies and then maybe they were citizens, maybe they weren't. This kind of decision needs to be taken up by the Supreme Court if the Trump administration is trying to get away with this. I just don't trust the intention behind it at all.
Naturally, Democrat would say that.
How strong do you think the Trump administration's case on this is at this point?
Well, you can only look at the fact that the Supreme Court granted what's called a writ of certiorari, and that means they agreed to hear the case. And per the Supreme Court rules, that means at least 4 justices agreed to hear it. Which way is it going to go? It's interesting because, in my view, this is just strictly speaking legally, this is a case of first impression. this has not been argued before. It was argued strictly in the context of slavery over the last 150 years. But in terms of illegal immigration, and whether it boils down to, does the United States, the government of the United States and its elected representatives have a right to control our own borders? Because if you say that people can come here illegally and then create citizens, that obviates a lot of obviates our sovereignty. And so that's what the Supreme Court is going to be weighing.
And to be clear, that argument is a lot better than the one that I heard earlier this year. I think that's a reframed argument. The one earlier this year was like talking about the legislative intent and purpose, which is really hard because the law was created a long, long time ago. And even though that's something that you are supposed to consider, it's very difficult to determine. This version of the argument that my co-panelist is talking about is much more likely to be considered favorably.
Thank you.
I want to get on to our next topic here. The Indiana House just approved a new congressional map that's designed to net Republicans 2 seats. It has yet to clear their state Senate, but just yesterday, the Supreme Court approved a redrawn congressional map in Texas that favors Republicans. Madeline, this is seen as a win for Republicans, but we also have a recent California law that favors Democrat redistricting. How do you see this all impacting the midterms next year?
Yeah, so I think the Dems are going to kick me out of the party after this interview tonight, but I have my own thoughts and opinions, and I appreciate NJD for that. So I'm actually a Hoosier. I'm from Indiana originally, and I grew up knowing that it was primarily a Republican state. Here's the difference in what's going on in Indiana versus California and Texas, right? Texas needed redistricting. Texas had an influx of immigrants over the last it wasn't 10 years because it's supposed to be 10 years in between when you have these redistricting efforts over the last 7 years or whatever it was, that has demonstrably changed what their voting electorate looks like. And so it made sense in Texas to do this. It does not make sense in California to do this because there hasn't been the same influx of people, right? Because you want your representatives to reflect the people and the wants and desires of those people in their district, in their state. However, in California, the people said we want it anyways, and I think that matters. In Indiana, the people said we don't want this, and they're doing it anyways. And the Senate in Indiana, the state Senate, has already said that they don't want to do this, and the House is pushing it. So for me, I think actually these 3 states have a very different way of handling things, and I would prefer if the representatives would do what their constituents want them to do instead of what the president top down is saying.
John, your thoughts?
Take a stab at that? Yeah. So in terms of how this impacts the midterms, basically redistricting, and this is what the Supreme Court reaffirmed, is the principle that states have the right. This is a question for the state legislators, and as long as they're not violative of federal law, and that's important because there's a case coming up about using race in determining districts. But basically, holding that issue aside, states legislatures have the right to. It's a matter of state law. In California, there was a constitutional amendment provided for a redistricting commission, but now under Prop 50, that's gone. So now it's back to the state legislature. The history, in terms of how this plays out, there's more room, generally speaking, for Republicans to gain seats through redistricting than Democrats. And here's why. The Democrats have they perfected this, and they really maximized their number of seats per state and optimize it for them long ago. For example, almost 40% of people in Illinois voted for President Trump, but they've got 2 congressional seats. California is at 42 to 9, and there was almost 38% of that voted for Republicans. So the Democrats have already, in a lot of these states, in Maryland, Republicans have only got 1 congressional seat, and they've got Republicans got a quarter of the vote. Republicans got 20% in Massachusetts, and Republicans have no congressional representation. So the Democrats have already maximized this. Republicans have been slow to the game on this, which is, and so there's more ceiling for the Republicans if, in fact, places like Indiana, for example, Utah, North Carolina, Texas, some of these states move, redistrict in ways that are more favorable to Republicans, then that probably brings parity to the whole exercise.
All right, we'll see how this battle continues. John Jordan and Madeline Somerville, always great to have you on. Thank you so much for sharing your insights today. President Trump is heading to Pennsylvania to talk to Americans about affordability next week.